I think Asia is very far away from the condition that it was in 1997 and the run up to 1997, especially if we look at Southeast Asia. You know, what we try to do is we look at the corporate fundamentals. We look and see if companies are improving their earnings and whether or not those earnings are backed up by cash flow. We also look at the debt to cash flow position in countries and companies. And what we find just now is that Southeast Asia looks perfectly fine. In fact, in many countries it looks better. Those countries look better than anywhere else in the world when it comes to corporate fundamentals. But there are problems in countries like China, India and Korea, which are of course big countries in the Asian region. Those countries, I think, have real economic problems. We're seeing that very specifically in India just now, less so in China because I think people are missing the point here. But I don't think that Asia generally is looking anything like 1997. And by the way, I think Europe, all the optimism about Europe is grossly misplaced. Well, of course, international reserves can help currencies avoid degrees of volatility, but that means that you spend those international reserves and the central bank's balance sheet shrinks. And as the central bank's balance sheet shrinks on the asset side, it also has to tighten on the liability side. And this is where I think people become very confused about international reserves. International reserves have already been used. The counterpart to international reserves is domestic money supply. So if international reserves fall, domestic money supply has to be tightened, it has to reduce as well. And I would say to you that international reserves are better not used to smooth out currency volatility. They've already been used, they're domestic liquidity now, and if they start to grow more slowly, then there's other elements that can produce more domestic liquidity, government spending, domestic credit growth. But there's no need to start fiddling around with the international reserves because all you get eventually is a backlash in terms of domestic monetary liquidity. I think the growth strategy should be quite simple, that governments should run appropriate monetary policies that allow monetary conditions, money supply and credit supply to grow at reasonable levels, which doesn't mean too fast. And at the same time, currencies should be allowed to move against their peer groups depending on the fundamentals and things like the current account and the direct investment inflow outflow position. And that's been happening this year. I'd like to see more emphasis in countries on money supply rather than on inflation targeting, which I think is a nonsensical policy. But that aside, I think Asian countries have actually been doing a reasonably good job of managing what have been very difficult monetary conditions for the last 5 years. Well, I think the biggest risk factor is a crisis in China, because that would have a sentiment impact as well as a physical export or demand for export impact throughout the region. And I'm not sure that that can be avoided given current policy settings. But that I would see as being certainly the biggest risk to the Asian region at the moment. That, of course, and a relapse in Europe, which should be inevitable next year.